Resume our lecture, The Nation Strikes Back, today with Don Kalb, who is an anthropologist, a Dutch anthropologist, full professor at the University in Bergen. He worked quite a long time the same profession at the Central European University in Budapest. And recently he is one of the directors of a research group on financialization from a social anthropological perspective. He works together with Chris Hahn, who have seen here last week, so they are collaborators, at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology in Halle in Germany. So he has strong connections also to Germany. He is working, he has worked in this field quite a while already. One of his recent publications is a collection about headlines of nations, subtext of class, working class populism, and the return of the repressed in neoliberal Europe, already 2010. He pointed me to mention one article already published in 2009, Conversations with a Polish Populist. So it's a great piece of anthropological work on the same topic, populism. And he also published in 2013 an article on financialization and the capitalist movement, Marx versus Weber, in the anthropology of global systems. So it's very close to our topic, also to this, what we do in sociology. You are very welcome, and we are listening, enjoying your presentation today.
Fantastic, Katarina, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to have you here. It was just great to see you make a little classroom revolution on behalf of our common interests. Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for inviting me. In fact, I don't know why that is so, but I rarely come to Berlin to talk. And so I'm very happy with this occasion. I was a student in Berlin in 1984. And I remember this seminar where about 80 people in the seminar. I mean, you know, normally in a seminar, we all know that. You have 20 people, 25 people, right? But there were 80 people in this publicistic seminar. And about 40 of them came 1 hour too late, and the other 40 went 1 hour earlier. And so that's my sort of intense experience of pre-1989 Berlin academic life. As you can imagine, I turned into a taxi driver in Berlin in those days. But then after that, I became an anthropologist, and I became, in fact, a Marxist anthropologist. And the great thing about Marxist anthropologists is that they can, at some points, be at a particular problematique or a particular topic and a particular place earlier than others, because they sense that something's going on. And that happened to me in retrospect. So I wrote in the early 2000s, and then it was publication 2009 and 2011, and I was teaching about it, about working class right-wing populism in Eastern Europe, in Poland first of all. I also worked on Hungary. And the interesting thing that I was there, let us say, well before the political scientists and the journalists. And that was because I was looking at Eastern Europe not from a regionalist perspective, and not from, let us say, a perspective defined within the paradigms that were deemed to be important at that point in time for Eastern Europe. Transitology, democratization. I thought what was happening was primarily just capitalism, proletarianization, dispossession, disenfranchisement. And very early on, I started that research in the late 1990s. I began to see that there was something happening in working classes in Europe as a whole, or in, let us say, the global north as a whole, if you want, that was, let us say, pushing towards the dissolution of the earlier social compacts. Let's say Fordism, the welfare state. Of course, we know about the arrival of neoliberalism in the 1980s. You know, Thatcher, Reagan, you know, Chile, all of these stories. But in the 1990s and in the early 2000s, everything that was happening in Eastern Europe was still interpreted intellectually in a completely liberal way. So this was about democratization, it was about freedoms, it was about economic growth, right? And it was actually undeniable in GDP terms. You know how it is, these conversations with economists, right? It was undeniable in GDP terms that yes, this region had started to grow again after 1996. There was economic growth and all of that. But what I was looking at was something very different. So I came to the region in 1997. I should give a little bit of perhaps a sort of personal history towards that. So I became an anthropologist in the 1980s. I started studying in 1979. In anthropology, you know, you did the Global South, right? You did fieldwork in the Global South. Well, you know, I was a little bit suspicious of all my colleagues doing that because for me it was also a form of tourism that we were doing. Nice weather, you know, traditional societies, beaches, traditional villages and so on. I wasn't so excited about it. That was for my holiday, in fact. Then where I studied, the Mediterranean area was important, right? So Mediterraneanist anthropology was, let us say in the Netherlands, at that point in time was about 30% of anthropology. And don't forget, at that point in time, Spain, Portugal, Greece were just coming into the EU. So there was a lot of attention to that. But again, I thought, you know, are these societies not in a way too nice to be intellectually invested in? Solidarność, 1980, 1981. I went to Poland. I participated in the occupation of universities. I had friends in Solidarność, was closely connected, stayed for a while, just as a student. And I was just gripped by it. And perhaps it is difficult to imagine how a socialist city looks like nowadays. It probably is difficult to imagine, but I can tell you honestly that apart from my recent engagement with China, I've never had such culture shock as about getting to know a socialist city. And I'm not talking about a specific city, but socialist cities as a generic category. They work totally differently from capitalist cities. There's a lot of people in public space, and it's not sorted out. And the rules are very fuzzy. There's a continuous negotiation going on. I was just gripped by the socialist city. Actually, all of you know Michael Burroyd, sociologist. Michael always tells the same story. The first time he came to Budapest, he was just gripped by it. And he had worked in South Africa and all of that. But the culture shock was in the socialist city as an experience that was just a deep puzzle. How is this working? Well, when I came to Poland, first went to Poznan, then Warsaw, I had exactly the same. And of course, this was also at a moment of major upheaval around Solidarność. I was a squatter in the Netherlands. I was already very much on the left. I stayed in Berlin as a squatter and then as a taxi driver, as you know by now. But I went to Poland also to understand Solidarność. And yeah, this was a working class movement, 10 million, as you know, 10 million members on a population of 40. Very, very impressive. And it was very disciplined and at the same time also chaotic. A lot of discussion was going on. A lot of passion and emotion was circulating, flowing. We all know that those 10 million, 20% were actually party members. which said enough about the party and the coherence of the party and the sort of the decline or the internal contradictions of really existing socialist ideology. And of course, there were a lot of white-collar workers in it. I've never been so interested like Western occupational sociologists, also of a Marxian type, like Eric Olin Wright, about that distinction between blue-collar and white-collar. I always thought that's a fascination of the welfare state, right? Where you want to, the Marxists want to align them, and the liberals want to separate them, and the conservatives want to confuse it all, right? I always had a suspicion that class was not about that blue-white distinction. And that was so clear in Solidarność. It was very much a blue-collar movement. It was very much led by white-collar people, by intellectuals, who could have been engineers, or who could have been philosophers. And it was that sort of swirl that was captivating. Now, anyhow, when I came back from Poland, there was martial law. And it was very difficult to go back to it and study, certainly from the Netherlands. From the US or the UK, it was somehow a bit easier. But in the Netherlands, I couldn't find a way to do that. So I worked on the Netherlands, and I wrote, well, a Marxist anthropological study about class formation in the Netherlands, with a focus on Philips and Eindhoven. So it was an urban industrial anthropology of class in the Netherlands. Basically asking why in the biggest capitalist concentration in the Netherlands, which was Philips at that point in time, and Eindhoven as a conurbation around it, why no left? So I've always been a Marxist of the absence of the left, in a way. And so you see how that sort of prepared me for working in post-1989 Eastern Europe. When I finished that dissertation, I wanted to go back to Eastern Europe. And so this is 1997, 1998. It was just 2 years after, basically in Brussels, it was decided that Eastern Europe should become part of the EU. Until 1995, that was a very, very fuzzy thing. There were no decisions about that. It was unclear what was going to happen there. Yeah, it had to be democratic, capitalist, and liberal, but how? Only after 1995, the sort of EU accession project became formulated. I was very interested in what was happening with those people that I had met earlier in Solidarność. We know about privatization, we know about capitalist restructuring. We had seen that already happening in the 1980s in Western Europe, and I had been studying that. Now, I wanted to know what the particular biographies were of the people I had met, or the sort of people that I had met in the early 1980s, in the 1990s, with democratic capitalist transition going on. So I was not looking at all, in fact, at the possibility of a large-scale working class right-wing illiberalism emerging. I had no idea about that at all. I came there to actually study capitalist restructuring and the biographies and the experiences and the way social relations were being changed, the way big enterprises were being broken up, the sort of politics, counter-politics that emerged from there, because I was hoping basically that my guys, who had been Trotskyists and anarchists in the early 1980s, would still be Trotskyists and anarchists in the mid-1990s and do something. Well, I found people who did something, and they were on the far right. And they were very explicit. And it was a complete eye-opener for me. And the eye-opener was basically about getting reconnected against my own choice to the anti-capitalist strands in pre-war fascism and National Socialism, which seamlessly merge with anti-capitalism within Christianity and within Christian conservatism. Right? And so these trends are there, and certainly when you are of my generation, you tend to think that anti-capitalism must be a left-wing thing, right? That's the story of modernity. But in Europe and in European traditions and in European history, there's a big underbelly of potentially right-wing, radical right-wing, illiberal thinking that is anti-capitalist, at least in rhetoric and at least in feel. And so I started to work in Wrocław here, around the corner. And the Solidarność units that had been formed and solidarities that had been formed in the early 80s, I learned that they had become reactivated in the mid-1980s. They had become very powerful around 88, 89. Some of them actually succeeded in basically claiming the factories in which they were located, and again, this is about blue-collar labor and white-collar labor, as more or less their property, in the literal sense, in the juridical sense, because after 85 in Poland, you had an arrangement where Volkseigentum was 50% property of the state, and potentially, if you could push it juridically, 50% property of the workers in those enterprises. Well, in my case and in Wrocław, there was a massive movement coming out of Solidarity that juridically claimed these enterprises. And that was going on from 85, and they were actually nominating their own directors, their own presidents of the board, their own financial directors. And so there was and connected to that, there was a strong movement for worker self-management. So there was still this ongoing strand that connected, let us say, Trotsky and Anton Pannekoek of 1917, 18, 1920 to what these guys were doing. Working class self-management. That was a very explicit topic. And there was a segment in the parliament that represented the working class self-management, the worker self-management movement in Poland. Now what happened was that close alliance of liberal left intellectuals and both white-collar and blue-collar working classes, that was the backbone of Solidarność and got reactivated in 1985, sort of got destroyed because the intellectuals turned ever more neoliberal in the later 1980s. And then, of course, sat at the round table and then basically became the state class. Well, the interests of the state class after 1989 in places like Poland and, of course, everywhere in Central and Eastern Europe were absolutely opposite to the interests of working classes, blue-collar and white-collar. Because what their interest was to get a fiscally sound situation, cutting all the subsidies, cutting all the links with the banking sector, and of course, restructuring the industry, privatizing it, selling it, making it competitive first, and then selling it on to investors on the Warsaw Stock Exchange, right? That was what was going on. So in the early 1990s, until let us say the late 1990s, you get what I call a class configuration. You get a class configuration where a state class that was a former political ally turns against you and is bent on destroying your power and your resource bases. And so that actually existing worker self-management in Wrocław, this is an urban study. This is not the same on the national level. There are other places that are like Wrocław, mainly in the southwest, but also in the northwest. And then there are other sort of places. But that working class self-management movement was very directly, literally, being destroyed by their former intellectual allies, now turned into a neoliberal state class. In response, and having lost the link with the left intellectual tradition, which is now being set up as your enemy, neoliberalized from within, they grabbed back to those right-wing traditions, There's right-wing anti-capitalist traditions. And so what you get, and for me this was a complete, well, a discovery. I really didn't anticipate anything of this. So what you get is, at the end of the 1990s, you had already formed what I call a neo-nationalist working class formation. That is at the same time about denying the existence of class, right? Because there's no class analysis there. But it is about emphasizing that, you know, the national people of Poland are being fucked by their own government and by the capitalist classes that the government is in cahoots with. Right? So that was the sort of intellectual, political configuration that was emerging. And I ran into that. And so I basically discovered the emergence of neo-nationalist illiberalism by looking for something very different. I was looking for class experiences and for the potential in Eastern Europe, in post-socialist Europe, for working classes, both white and blue, to actually talk back to capitalist transition. The talking back was illiberal, nationalist, sometimes anti-Semitic, and I didn't like it. But, and here's the interesting thing, I did like quite a few of the people we were talking to. These were brave people, impressive people. And so I've never sort of allied with those who said that you know, it's very unpleasant to deal with the right. That was not my experience. I was confused and puzzled, but it was not unpleasant. These were respectable people. Now, one of them became my key informant. Zadrožny, he was about 2 meters tall, and he had been a basketball coach. He had gone to prison in 1981. He had escaped. He got unemployed after that, and he was a high-altitude factory chimney sweeper. So he was the guy who climbed the chimneys and go in from above and clean it. When he talked, you know, he had these rooms, you know, 1,000 people, 1,500 people. Everybody was silent, and they were listening to him. And his sister was very active in the emerging right-wing party of the Kaczynskis. She was, let us say, on the second echelon there, and she had direct access to what was not yet PIS ministers. And they collaborated very closely, and their analysis, their social analysis, their economic and industrial analysis, closely reflected the experiences of the Polar factory where both had been working and that I was studying. And that Polar factory, which is now Whirlpool, it's white goods. That Polar factory survived the privatizations and all of that, but in a very slimmed off form, and ultimately was sold, well, to Whirlpool. So this was what I found in the late 1990s. And then I didn't actually know exactly what to do with this immediately. I didn't know how to write about it. I was literally also confused about what to do. I had a lot of detailed material, and it went into a direction that was too, I couldn't grasp it yet, analytically. Then I got a little bit of money in the mid-2000s, and I was working at CEU, and I had some good students working on Poland, and I said, okay, let's go back to Wrocław, and let's go back to the same people, and see what has happened to them over the last 7 years that I haven't covered earlier. And we went back to them, and they were even more eloquent, and they were even more sort of concerted, radical right. They were very active supporters of the Kaczynskis. And they were complaining about all sorts of typically working class things, right? Super exploitation. They could show with the figures at hand from the Polar factory that their productivity had gone up with a factor of 7. So they worked 700% more efficiently than in the late 1990s. And that had just gone on in a 6-7 year period. Hierarchy in the factory had increased enormously, right? Whereas no socialist hierarchy. Yeah, you have a foreman, and the foreman can bark to you and all of that. But there is a strong sort of power base from which you can speak back, and you have your colleagues. You know, socialist hierarchy is certainly not the same as capitalist hierarchy. Capitalist hierarchy hits, bats, like that. And they could show the figures, right? So there were many more foremen than used to be the case under socialism. The exploitation of time, so the impossibility of having small pauses or even actually going to the toilet. They were complaining all the time about a couple of cases that happened of female workers who were wearing Pampers because they didn't get time to go to the toilet and they had to pee. And so there was a lot of this stuff coming out. It's not just about factories. And I should tell you a little bit more about what anthropologists think about the notion of class, but I do that in a moment. It's not just about factories. They showed how within neighborhoods, prices were rising very fast. There was ever more suspicion of neighbors. Insecurity was very high. The police was selling its services to the highest bidders. There was no way to keep control over social reproduction. Primary education, kindergarten sector, all heavily underinvested, basically collapsing at that point in time. And of course, the deep complaint about emigration already. Our kids don't want to live here. We have fought for this place. And people go. None of them stay. And they actually make children in the UK, but not here. And you see already the connection to the child benefits. Right? So there was the Kaczynskis and PIS have reacted so smartly by putting so much emphasis on subsidizing social reproduction. Already in the mid-2000s, it was very clear for me that, yeah, so you have this critique on capitalist exploitation on the shop floor. But the critique extends and it unifies the critique of everyday life outside of the shop floor, which, as you know, in Marxism and in anthropology, we call social reproduction. Right? There was no way in which you could go on living decently. They were emphasizing to me. Very important category. You can't go on living decently here. And these were politically motivated people and politically experienced people, connected people. And so what I was running into in the mid-2000s was the popular and the populist underbelly of the Kaczynski project. When you read Katrina and Mihai's stuff on the think tanks, for me that is an eye-opener, because I met the same issues and the same already sort of emergent policy proposals in a way on the surprisingly articulate level among working classes, in conversations with working classes. All these issues that PIS later date were already sort of announced in the conversations that I reported in my American Ethnologist article of 2009, Conversations with a Polish Populist. So yeah, that was an amazing experience. And so writing about that, before the financial crisis and before the whole craze about, well, the nation strikes back, and before the, let us say, the West was turning partly illiberal and in any case neo-nationalist too, was exciting. I was writing about something that I felt was something that was going to happen, perhaps everywhere, right? That was my feeling. I'm writing about Poland. I'm actually writing about Wrocław. I'm writing about Zadorny. But he is telling the things that I can hear basically everywhere. Of course in Polish, of course with Polish themes, informed by a Polish history of protest, of mobilization, of socialism, of the Soviet Union up there. But this combination of a post-socialist illiberalism in a post-socialist neoliberal context felt to me as something that was very, very powerful and representative for something wider than Zadorny, Wrocław, or Poland. And so I became one of the first who wrote about this stuff. But by saying that, I wrote about it because I discovered it in surprise, anthropologically, by looking for something else, which is, in terms of methodology, also an interesting thing to emphasize. And when I say that, I also realize that from that moment onwards, I have stuck to my position that the rise of the right is about class. And so this is what I want to talk about now, in a more general way. How much time do I have, Katerina? Another 15 minutes?
Oh, you have more.
More even? Okay, good, good.
So you should stop quarter after.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Now, first let me tell you a little bit about anthropology and class, and why I think the class concept is so important. So last week you had my good friend and good colleague Chris Hahn here. Now Chris works on the countryside and is a Polanyian. I work on urban contexts and I'm a Marxist. That's an interesting combination. And you think there's a logic behind the differentiation there. Because you cannot think about urban contexts without understanding class. And I will explain again what I mean with that. Of course, peasants are also a class, right? So I'm not saying to Chris, you're all fine as a Polanyian in the countryside. No, I push him that he should be more Marxist, but that is a secondary story. Now, first of all, class is not only about working classes. Class is first of all about capitalist classes and is about capital. So the idea, I mean, you all study sociology, right? Or something like it, yeah, right, or something like it, like what I do, something like sociology. Now, of course in the 1970s and 80s there was a lot of interest in class. You know, and the new social history, and E.P. Thompson, Eric Hobsbawm, and all of that stuff. But the assumption was very much that class was about working classes, and class consciousness was about working class consciousness, right? And then, of course, all of that collapses in the course of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, and so there is no class anymore, except that it collapses because of the victories of the capitalist class, right? I was in a debate with Eric Olin Wright about 10 years ago, and God have his soul. I admire his work, but it was very difficult for Eric to sort of shift to my vocabulary that class is first of all about capital, and capital forms the working class, and capital, there's surplus capital, and it needs to be valorized, and something needs to be done with that, and that is where urbanization emerges, right? This is what basically David Harvey's work is all about, right? It's about the capitalist surplus. What do you do with it? You need to urbanize, you need infrastructure, you need long-term planning, you need a state that can do all these sorts of things. Right? So capital and capitalist surpluses and capitalist class power is the third thing that you need to know about class. And then the second thing is that one of the regular things that capitalist class power does and capitalist state do is waging class struggle against working classes, right? So the idea that there is no class, that in the last 30 years there was no class struggles is complete nonsense. There's class struggle from above. And that's precisely why we don't see so much class struggle from below. And that's precisely why class consciousness from below crumbled, collapses, gets disorganized, disoriented, and of course, displaced towards the right, towards neo-nationalism, towards illiberalism, towards a rhetoric that in the absence of class power can in any case articulate publicly some of the things that you're concerned about, right? The reproduction of the reproduction of our whole region, reproduction of the nation, working class honor, the honor of the working people. I know all of this is very ambivalent at the same time, and it might be very right-wing at the same time. But these are also left-wing issues, right? So one of the, let us say, the new things of the right in the last, well, 10 years, 15 years, is precisely this appropriation of the old leftist themes in a right-wing direction. Now, okay, so class, first about capital. Then it's about struggle. It's the struggle that capital does to everybody else, to us. I don't care whether it's white collar or blue collar. Working classes, I call them. But I use that in the plural, and I have no idea that this is a Fordist working class blue collar male in the factory. That's not class. That's 20th century class, perhaps, or a little part of the 20th century. But that is not class universally. And so my position is that we need to reoccupy the class position from the present, from the contemporary, from the issues that play in the here and now, which are far beyond the Fordist issues, and far beyond, the blue-collar working class in factories, male, right? So I don't need intersectionality to talk about class. Class is always a very fuzzy thing, and only at very, very few moments in history and in space, classes can unify and formulate collective, shared, common identities that are antagonistic against capital or against capitalist state. That happens only, once in a while. And in the meantime, there is still class. And it's fuzzy, and classes don't speak the language of class, and they can be molded and formed into all sorts of directions by capital, by intellectual elites, by political elites, political entrepreneurs, ethno-political entrepreneurs, neo-nationalist political entrepreneurs, and out of that emerge particular class formations. So for me, the concept of class formation, again, is not only when classes talk the language of class. That is an exceptional case. All right, and then here's the last thing about class. Anthropologists don't believe in economic class. I hear a lot also my Marxist friends, Mike Davis, even David Harvey sometimes. They usually talk about economic class. Why would you call it economic class? Yeah, class is always economic, so why call it economic class? Does it mean that the only thing that is relevant is my relation to wage earning? Because that is apparently economic class. The only thing that is relevant, how much I earn, how much money I have in my pocket, that is economic reductionism. That's what neoliberals do. I don't think Marxists should do that. Now, and the second is sociological class or social class, right? Anthropologists don't want to work with that because social class in that sense or sociological class in that sense is a formed class that is aware of its being a class and can draw boundaries around. It's a class for itself in the classic Marxian sense. Or it is a class in itself that doesn't know at all about its classness but is simply being defined by the sociologist as such. And then it's basically a category, but not a class. Now, anthropological class assumes the fuzziness, assumes the as a given, right? It's fuzzy. Assumes the difficulty of drawing boundaries, assumes the difficulty of finding common understandings. All of that is no problem. Yes, it's very much about economics, but it's also very much about social reproduction. It's very much about gender. It's very much about urban space. It's very much about state forms. It's very much about everyday life, right? It's very much, for example, about education, the sort of things that we all think we have to learn. Now, 80% of what education is nothing else than the stuff that we need to learn in order for our capitalists to exploit us profitably and win on the labor market, on the capitalist global market, right? So class is this sort of, I call it basically social reproduction. Class is a relationship of social reproduction. It's about the sets of relationships that we have to set in motion day after day in order to reproduce, given historical circumstances, under conditions not of our own choosing, right? We can go on this for a long while, but that is, in a sort of nutshell, how I approach class thinking. And I also think that if the left wants to reoccupy class in a way that allows it to draw back to universalist, emancipatory, liberating, autonomous, I don't know how you want to call it, program, those people who have now moved to the right, then it needs to reoccupy class, but it's not the class of the 20th century, right? Now, from there, the last part of my talk. So I said that I have stuck to my position that I discovered on the basis of Wrocław and Poland and Eastern Europe in the early 2000s, that it is class processes that produce the illiberal right. When I say that, this is not the same sort of claim as that you hear in the liberal press. So if the liberal press these days says, it's the white working class who can now finally be just racist, and they vote for Trump, right? Or nationalists, and they vote for Brexit, and et cetera, in the continent. We have all our specific stories here. Then that is not what I mean with it. The white working class is an oxymoron. I don't think that working classes are inevitably racist. What a nonsense. What or who is inevitably racist? Yeah, racist, but nobody else. When I stick to my position on class, I stick to a position that is historical and processual and relational, and not essentialist. And so it basically means that yes, I see this illiberal wave that I already found in Poland emerging the late 90s, 2000. I see this now being generalized. And it's very important to realize that it is generalized. We have national chapters in a global story, in a global book. That happens as a consequence of the dispossessions, the disenfranchisements, the neoliberalizations of the last 30 years, right? So if I talk about class as the explanation for the rise of neo-nationalism and the neo-nationalist liberal right, then I don't say it is a particular group who votes for Trump and therefore I say there is a process there that destroys the capacity for common people to talk back in a left-wing way. And so the left evaporates. And these people can be picked up after a while by ethno, neo-nationalist, political entrepreneurs, oligarchs, I don't know what. And they can throw them to a new sort of political program and produce over time a new sort of right-wing, Gramscian hegemony, right? And that has been happening over time, and that is where we are. So it's about the destruction of the possibility of a left, even though people were actually also fighting for that possibility, even, let us say, the people that I was talking with in Wrocław. Over time, there's destruction of the possibility of talking back in a left-wing, solidary way to capital and the capitalist state. The positions for that have been destroyed. The globalization of capital leaves national states as an empty shell that only allow ethno-talk, but do not allow to talk back to the globalization of capital. And that is where the conservative developmental state project comes in, right? And so what's so interesting about the anthropology of class is that you can show that this developmental new conservative state project that is now happening basically all around us, because the EU is itself basically being hollowed out by these projects, and it will be accommodated to it. It will not disappear. It will be accommodated to it, but it won't be better, even though, well, no, it won't be better. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. I stop here, and then we have time for discussion.
Okay, the floor is yours. Who wants to open?
You mentioned that for you, the ways I would say for...
Can you speak very loud? My
Yeah.
ears are bad.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You said that the way for you, in order for left-wing parties to come back to politics and the center of them, is this social reproduction, correct? And I was asking myself, what would be a practical example of a policy that is tied to the social reproduction?
Well, first of all, I mean, you've just here in Berlin, you've just have this rent freeze actions that were going on, right? Well, that is of course very much about social reproduction. So I mean, when you read Marx, there's a lot about production all the time, you know, people are producers. And of course, Marx was just fascinated by the factory and by the capacities for production that were exploding in the mid-19th century. But of course, are we interested in production? Are we doing our things day after day because of production? We don't care. What we do is we try to reproduce, right? We try to live on. And that living on is under pressure. And so that is where I want to locate the possibilities for a new form of class analysis, right? And so fighting against neoliberal states that privatize major parts of social reproduction, of everyday life you can call it, is certainly something that has to happen. But that is where I want class analysis to emerge. So now you have all these sectoral analyses, and you have an idea of the commons and a little bit, you know, Polanyian and so on. But I want it to be very clear that all these privatizations and all these things that make our daily life sometimes very difficult, and the reproduction over time under threat, that these are things that have closely to do with class, right? And in particular with the interest of an entirely financialized state in cahoots inevitably with big capital to produce revenues and to not subsidize our daily lives, right? There's a massive redistribution of monetary flows from below to above going on, which has everything to do with the fact that we have very indebted states and so on. We can talk about financialization, a very interesting topic, because at the same time we have learned in the last 10 years from nobody else than Mr. Bernanke that money is just for free, right? Quantitative easing just injected 25% of OECD GDP into the circuits of capital. And that sort of money can simply be created. Now it has only been created for capitalist social reproduction, but it can also be created for us. And there is no inflation, right? And so, you know, all these sort of debates. And there is no inflation because we are in a very new period of capitalism, where very different forces are being assembled. And so we need to reoccupy the class position so that we can actually deal in an intellectually updated way with the sort of position that we are in now. And that is why I think on the terrain of social reproduction, there's a lot to do. I don't want to talk about intersectionality, for example. I don't, intersectionality, you know, I'm a socialist feminist. But intersectionality is basically about identities, about synchronic identities, where all of us are somehow a little bit split between our class position, our gender position, our race position, our ethnic position. You can imagine other sort of thing. But I don't think that identity is so interesting. Process is interesting. The direction in which things are being pushed and are going. And we need to find common interests within that. And that is where you need to talk class against capital and against the capitalist state. Sufficient for an answer?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, please.
So thank you, Mateusz Wołkowski. It was really interesting for me to see your view also with these remarks on this historical context of the 80s. And I would say that I share your view on not from Marx's position, but I think this is quite common misunderstanding of Solidarity, of Solidarność, as a kind of liberal movement.
Yeah.
So the Solidarność was not liberal as such. So and apart of that was quite an eclectic movement, and in the underground phase in the 80s, after introduction of martial law, so it was not only as quite often was perceived in the West. So the limited to the circles of civic committee and the leaders of the movement, but also by the nature of underground activity was quite fragmented and eclectic from below, and as I said, not liberal as such.
Yeah.
And I think so. All these participants, rank and file participants, built, and this is this formulation by Jan Kubik, also from anthropological point of view. So there's the solidarity as a cultural class. So this is a phenomenon, and he wanted to explain and understand why solidarity vanished, so disappeared after 1989. And his formulation was that solidarity in 1980 was such a cultural class, social-cultural class, which disappeared after 1989, so was fragmented and demobilized. But I think that taking this particular formulation, argument about solidarity as a class, as a cultural class, I think it's quite important. In fact, that some parts of leaders, of activists of the Solidarność, who felt left behind, and together with some working class members of the movement, left behind after Balcerowicz reform, neoliberal reform. So they and this is the explanation, and they started to so to say reproduce solidarity as they imagined that, as kind of political mobilization. And I think it's quite important to understand, and I agree with you, so that we are not able to understand the conflict in Poland, political conflict now, without taking into account the fact that solidarity was very pluralistic, eclectic, and not liberal movement. And and part of the explanation are this fragmentation from the times of before 1989. And this story you presented can be presented also. So as I said, not necessarily from the Marxist or anthropological Marxist point of view, but also with tools of social movement theory. And yes,
I agree.
I think it's quite useful picture you delivered. So.
But would you agree to the notion that Solidarność is was a cultural class?
Well, I know Kubik's work, and I'm fine if Kubik talks like that. Kubik is indeed, of course, not a Marxist, and he's a culturalist. So he's, let us say, my enemy camp in anthropology, right? Because in anthropology we have a big culturalist camp, and then you have a couple of other people who are shooting on that. I'm one of the others. But what is important, of course, is that it is not just, it was never a liberal movement, right? Even though it was deeply democratic in all sorts of ways, right? And so what happened to me last year was very interesting. So some Polish museum directors discovered my work, and they took it so that article of 2009, and they took it as the basic text for an exhibition under the Warsaw Biennale about populism. And so what my text did was give back to them the democratic possibilities of 1980s and early 1990s Solidarność. Whereas, of course, the critical intelligentsia in Poland was, in the last 30 years, became ever more used in dismissing Solidarność as always already right-wing, etc., etc. But so what is now happening is that the liberal left in Poland seems to be rediscovering the Solidarność heritage, which I think is absolutely essential in Poland for a left to be viable. You know?
Yeah, please.
I think that for Marxist class analysis, it is essential not only to understand the totality of social reproduction through the lenses of the concept of class, but also to analyze the potential of a radical social transformation. So where is the agenda of social transformation in your class analysis?
Yeah, I totally agree. So in that sense, class is always a non-empiricist concept, right? It's very much about potentialities too. So it's about people who discover the commonality and the common interests in people who discover their common interests in fighting the forces that they are up against, right? So in that sense, class is always about both describing a process of exploitation and democratic repression and dispossession and disenfranchisement, etc., and at the same time the possibility of uniting against that and finding a common identity, right? Even though I don't think that we need a fully shared, fully sort of crystallized common identity, even the effort to do that is good enough. And then it will mostly always somehow also fail. But that is not so important. That's for later. But it's the effort itself that is part of the class promise. Right? And then of course we can talk about the commons as another sort of concept that might be important there. But yeah, I totally agree about that. Yeah, and I also, yeah, right. Look, this is of course also where in the end exploitation in labor is important, inevitably for class, even when I am in favor of this wide social reproduction-oriented class concept and the exploitations, etc., that are happening there. And you might not even, you might want to be very sort of narrow Marxist and say that is not even exploitation. I'm fine, I'm flexible about that. But of course, in labor and in work, it is sometimes easier to talk back to capital and to discover common positions, right? Whereas in privatized everyday life and social reproduction, that is much harder. So that is also why I do think that labor movements are simply very important. Right? Without labor movements, it is very difficult to envision the capacity to collectively discover interests and talk back and actually do something. Labor is important because if you collectively refuse labor, capital is dead, right? And there's nothing else in social reproduction that can threaten to kill capital, like a strike can do. But it's never enough. It's only the necessary point.
Nadia?
Yes, if I may go back in your speech a little bit, I would be very interested to hear more about the populist valley, undervalley you talked about of Kaczynski's project later. If you could describe it a little bit more, like what you saw in the end of 1990s, middle of 2000, what had changed, how did they call themselves, how they were organized. So whom did you actually see there? So because you didn't go very much into detail,
Okay.
Very interesting to me.
Yeah. Of course, the easy way to answer this is to say, read that article of mine. Okay. So if you promise to do it, then I tell you now what's in. Look, I think, so it was very much about losing control, about what they saw as their factories, right? And when they were talking about their factories, this was socialism, right? This was factory not just as a production unit, but factory as a community, and as a community of fate, as a whole, unified collectivity collectivity of people who depend in their social reproduction on that factory. And then that factory allows you to have education for your children, a kindergarten for your children, holidays, etc., etc.
The distribution also. The part of the distribution.
Exactly, because socialist reproduction works so much via the factories or via the workplace, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be a factory, but I was looking at that polar factory very precisely. So I'm talking about factories, but it can be bureaucracies, it can be schools, it can be anything, right? So for that is also so interesting, because I sort of earlier I was much more on labor. I'm still on labor, but later I began to talk much more about social reproduction as a whole. But that was also because my informants were doing that all the time. And for them, production was really socialist production. It was about the production of life, the production of possibilities for tomorrow. And so the target of their critique was very much the state and liberalism. And the liberal elite that was formerly their ally, the intellectuals, right? They didn't trust them at all. And then, of course, it was Michnik, Kuremak, etc. The state had maneuvered in such a way since the early 1990s that collective property, the factory, and all the rest that belonged to it was broken down, was dispossessed from them. Don't forget that I was talking about that they actually had not only de facto but also de jure an effective claim on owning this stuff. It's very interesting, but that is quite typical, for Yugoslavia too, but also for Poland. It doesn't happen anywhere else in that same vocabulary, in that legal way in Eastern Europe. But they had a claim on, this is our stuff, these are our factories, we have worked for them. So in the early 1990s, when the borders were being thrown open for exports from the West into Poland, but Poland could not yet export to the West, there's a 3-year period between 1991 and 1994, I think, where this was the arrangement. Well, that is, the state class decided that this was going to happen, but this, of course, leads to the destruction of everything, right? There's no factory that can compete against being over-flooded by much more advanced productions from elsewhere. And the banking sector gave them loans. This was still a state banking sector. And with the loans, they added 50%. So it was sort of co-financing. They got loans from state banks. And they invested their own saved money. And we're talking about employees numbering at that point in time about 5,000. So they save from their own monthly salary. And they invest together with a loan from the state into a new production line, dishwashers, which they thought would be successful. And of course that thing collapses a couple of years later. And it collapses at the moment that state simply calls back the loan, and they need to pay back the loan in 3 months' time, and they don't have the money. And so these are the processes by which they get dispossessed, literally dispossessed from what they thought was theirs. And so there is a biting critique, entirely Marxist, right? A biting critique on dispossession, aimed at privatization and at the tricks around privatization that the state was employing. But the interesting thing about that populist underbelly, look, in the social sciences, we never know where ideas come from. You can do intellectual history, like what you've been doing with the think tanks. That is important stuff, but that's only one source of ideas. These are intellectual ideas, first of all. Now, be aware that this is happening before the establishment of a consolidated right-wing ideology on an intellectual level. Right? So the think tanks are not yet there. The political elites are not yet there. They're fuzzy. They don't know. But what I thought I was discovering was how basically common people, rooted in their own specific experiences of dispossession, were already voicing a critique, which then later got picked up. And I told you that
I mean, we say common people, but you know, Poland is also a democratic country in that sense, and these were very activist people, so they were well connected with the AWS at that point in time, elites, and there was a lot of conversation going on. By the way, these people are of course also not tabula rasas, so they interpret their specific populist or popular experience of dispossession in particular terms. They didn't talk about dispossession, that's my term, but it's, you know, it's a neutral description of what they're talking about, or a Marxist description if you like. But they were talking a lot about dignity, for example. And much of their language was language, I think, that goes back to the interbellum or earlier right-wing Catholic projects in Europe, not just Poland, but in Europe generally. Right? And the dignity concept fits there very well. And there is certainly in right-wing Catholicism of a laborist kind, which exists in France, in the Low Countries, in Germany, in Poland too. There's a strong idea of worker dignity. And they picked up on that. And they had learned that language at Sunday school in the early 1970s in the Polish villages where they were born. Right? So it is this mix of intellectual sources, experiential sources that already in the 1990s, I think, produced that underbelly of a populist potentiality for a liberal political emergence. Illiberal political emergence. Thank you. Yeah?
So maybe the populism is in such sense just democratic corrective.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so when I say illiberal populism, I can't say I'm against it. It is a necessary political correction, and it goes in the wrong direction. But you know, we need to fight for that.
Yeah, I see three questions. Maybe we collect now, a little bit at least, right?
Okay, thank you for your talk. It was very inspiring. And my background is in sociology, and I live in London. And my question would be about this kind of betrayal of intellectuals in the split between working class and intellectuals. So, how do you see that these leanings and we don't say campaigns, but definitely a kind of counter attack on intellectuals in these countries can be understood, the fruitfulness of these campaigns can be understood as a consequence of this betrayal?
That's a simple answer. I would say yes. Yeah. Look, and I speak again entirely personally here. I mean, of course, also with my story, no, but also just personally. So I became, in 1998, the director of the SOCO program in Vienna. SOCO, the Social Consequences of Economic Transformation in Eastern Europe. And this was Ford Foundation money that I was spreading around among small groups of social policy researchers in Eastern Europe. And the hope was, you know, I mean, 1992, the communists come back into power. First in Poland and then in Hungary. And of course, you know, in the US there was panic, in the West there was panic. We're losing Poland, who is losing Poland? And so the Ford Foundation thought that the contribution that they could make to this was to help turn all these neoliberal intellectuals who just wanted the market, wanted the West, and they just wanted to cut down all these unproductive workers, because there was a strong, you know, I mean, there was a strong racism going on. It's something very interesting for Eastern Europe. There is intellectuals can have a very strong anti-unskilled labor racism. In the sense that, you know, these people, they always fuck it up. And I was talking, so I was going around with little bits of money and trying to form teams of research to do, well, things that could help to reinstall constructive thinking about welfare states among intellectuals in Eastern Europe. It wasn't easy, you know. Some of them were more interested in, you know, is it safe to park my Opel Kadett here? And you know, I was really quite annoyed very often with these people. But in particular, I was talking to three top government advisors on the pension reform in Poland. and the way they talked about minors, it's worse than, let's say, South Africans talking about blacks, really, and I was so neoliberalism had a very missionary zeal quite often in Eastern Europe, and there were intellectuals formulating that zeal. And it is very understandable that people being subjected to their experiments at some point say, yeah, that is what has happened. And it was also the sort of stuff that I was personally warning against in the late 1990s. But I didn't care. They saw that position that the sort of stuff that they were doing was the future of humanity. And not just me, everyone.
Okay, let's try to put.
We had a small discussion last week with Prof, and within this discussion, someone came up with the theory that what we see as neo-nationalists, basically what it does is re-embedding in a Polanyian way the market. So I personally, I tend more to the Marxist interpretation, but I would be curious to hear what you think of this idea that although they have anti-capitalist sentiments, what they do is re-embed.
Sure, I totally agree. Right, so they're right-wing anti-capitalists, and they need the nation state, to do, well, re-embedding capital accumulation to some extent within the nation, which is a project of bourgeoisie formation. Right, that is what most of them really do, and that's also where economic development comes in. Right, there's a little bit of redistribution going on, and there's quite a lot of rhetoric about the dignified worker and the dignified common people and so on. Not so much the worker, but sometimes the worker. In particular in Poland, there's still, so I wrote a paper where I showed that let's say, illiberalism in Poland is much more labor-driven, and that's why solidarity was important. It's much more labor-driven than in Hungary, for example, where it's much more racist and social reproduction-driven, and has its origins in its period of peaking in the late 2000s and early 2010 in anti-Gypsyism, right? And so there's a lot of differences there, but what they all share is a fascination with the national bourgeoisie. And that is also, of course, where they link up with earlier leftist projects like in Latin America. Like in Latin America, where you have, Wallerstein and so on, the evidencia theory was very much about, creating national bourgeoisie against the cosmopolitan capitalist class. So these are old efforts. In that sense, there's actually nothing new. The context is new, but not so much the contents. The trouble, I think, with the re-embedding effort is not so much Polanyi is fine. Polanyi is really just fine. But the national context, that's the trouble. What we need is a re-embedding of economic flows, if you want, on a higher level. Right? And so we need a European state and a world state and all of that. And all these things are not going to happen because capital doesn't want it to happen. Capital needs to play out all these territorial units against each other. And that's the long history of capital. Right? And those territorial units were actually just developed. You need a very long-term view for it. Well, some people would say it's not even a very long-term view, but you need a 500-year view to understand that the emergence of capitalism goes together with the creation of nation-states, empires and nation-states. And they are being carved out of territories that used to be empires before. That's the world system. And capital plays out all these units against each other, make it indebted to itself, etc., etc. You create divisions of labor over them. It works very nicely, but you don't want unified empires, world empires, like let's say the Social Democratic EU or something like that, or Socialist EU. The trouble about Polanyi is not the embedding, disembedding concept, even though it is analytically very fuzzy and creates a lot of analytical trouble all the time. It is not the counter-movement concept. which is again analytically very fuzzy. But it's not so much a problem. You can use it. Actually, I do think that we see Polanyi and counter movements. Because the interesting thing about Polanyi versus Marx is precisely that Polanyi cannot predict whether it's right or left. And who is there? Is that, you know, a classic Marxian working class? Or is it an alliance between a classic Marxian working class, other sorts of working classes, petty bourgeoisies, and perhaps even state bureaucrats? It's entirely unclear in Polanyi. Right? And so the class origins of the counter movement and the class impetus of the counter movement needs to be added to Polanyi. So those concepts are fuzzy, they're useful, but fuzzy. But the problem really is the national state. Right? So I'm entirely in favor for a counter movement on an EU level, for example, and on a global level too.
May I jump in, and then we have one final question. When you described so impressive this guys from the Solidarność and how they turned into peace supporters, but why they buy a concept which is promoting national bourgeoisie and family policy mainly? Why they are not in labor rights? Why is I mean, this is typical for conservatism, that labor rights do not play a major role. Redistribution, yes. Re-embedding of markets, they also use it to, they know Polanyi and they quote Polanyi, yeah, these guys. But it's not about labor rights. It's strengthening unions, new union rights. So why those people who have such experience buy this? And then the final question, where's the final question? Someone raised his hand?
Yeah, I have a question, but I'm willing to give up my spot if somebody else is.
I do not see someone else, so we have
Okay, I'll be quick then. And sort of related to the last two questions. Going back to your comments about labor, Don, and how you favor reproduction in the understanding of class, but labor is also important. Now, my question is, in a sense, and I'm not just thinking about the most recent theories about technological unemployment due to automation. I'm thinking about longer-term processes of mass underemployment due to changes within capitalism. And these long-term processes of mass underemployment, they threaten labor. In fact, we're dealing with a short supply of labor, which in a sense also threatens class positions that depend on labor and labor rights. So yeah, we can talk about unions, we can talk about labor rights, but a lot of people they just want to work in order to survive, and there's no work. And so in what sense does illiberal populism in Eastern Europe try to address this issue? Or do you think you address it, or is it just a question of re-embedding the market and doing reproduction?
Let me answer this first, and then I come to you, because the two connect in an interesting way. Look, this of course, it's a very important point, right? And so, of course, we've had a lot of emigration from Eastern Europe. It's a very important factor. If we hadn't had that, we would have still had a large surplus population in Eastern Europe. Now, that surplus population existed in the early 2000s, late 1990s, and then declined in volume, in numbers, right, because of emigration. But there is, of course, still a lot of surplus population in Central and Eastern Europe, which is now seen as not sufficiently skilled, or it is too old, etc. Right? But here is precisely the point where illiberalism Hungarian style starts. Right? So while Polish illiberalism is more labor-driven, and I do think, I mean, so the people that I was talking to were very active also with local labor constituencies in relation to capital and so on. There was a lot of negotiation going on. They could mobilize people actually, but perhaps that is an exception. I don't know. But Hungarian illiberalism emerges exactly at the point where, and then of course you need to think about the Roma as the largest segment of the surplus population, but it is not necessarily only the Roma. But Hungarian illiberalism emerges where it starts to define a very strict border between the deserving working class and the surplus population. So, and that is, which is of course first of all. And so the surplus population is a dangerous class, gypsy criminality. So that's a classic mid-19th century and earlier figure, right, that it uses. And so what it does in the Hungarian case, it compensates the Hungarian working class for a lack of support in work and labor against capital, with the satisfactions, with the symbolic satisfactions of allowing it to punish and to look down upon the surplus population. Right? So in that sense, Hungarian liberalism is much meaner than Polish. But that is a connection, right? And so generally, there is of course a deflection going on from class contestations towards symbolic, ethno-symbolic issues of deservingness and respect and so on, and dignity and so on. So the dignity language comes back, but it's only the dignity that is given to the productive members of the nation. Right? And then the productive members of the nation also want to be productive in their families and have children. Right? That's the sort. But it's all about, it's about value. We have a project about value. It's about value. It's about how a nation can valorize itself in the face of competitive capital by being obedient, by being productive, by creating children, etc., etc. And there's a very, very particular illiberal idea of value going on, which connects to capitalist value.
This is not anti-capitalist.
It is not anti-capitalist. It can only be once in a while rhetorically anti-capitalist. And it might be actually rhetorically anti-cosmopolitan capitalism and very much in favor of creating national bourgeoisie. Yeah. So it's a super fuzzy thing.
Okay, that's it. Thank you so much for being here, for discussing us. Thank you so much for giving us this wide talk and this interesting